So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of going with or without a framework like Redux to help you manage state as a state container, or as a way to avoid prop drilling, which is becoming one of the main reasons people choose to reach for a React middleware for managing state. It's becoming more than often just a way to avoid prop drilling. What is prop drilling? That's the first thing I want to discuss real quick. Prop drilling is when you have a cascade of multiple components and levels deep, and you're passing down props from great-great-grandparent component into great-great-grandchild component, and it's touching everybody in that DOM tree, in that React tree. So the parents are touching it, they're not using it, but they're aware of it because they have to pass it from the parent, from their parents, for that prop to get all the way down to the child. So that's what prop drilling is all about. Is prop drilling bad? It has a bad stigma associated with it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But a lot of times, what people try to do is they try to adopt a framework such as React, such as Redux, or another Flux container implementation, middleware such as Unstated or Mobux or whatever they're called these days, and they try to adopt those to avoid prop drilling or threading, as it's called as well these days. So the reason prop drilling has a bad stigma is mainly because of the way people implement or create components without using the same prop names, if that makes sense. So if my grandparent has a prop that's called car label, and the grandchild component uses that same prop, but in the grandchild component, that prop is called car tag ID. So the grandparent is calling it car label, the grandchild is calling it car tag ID. So as you pass it down from the great grandparent to the great grandchild or whatever, you have to keep in context, in mind, that name will change. So as you're passing down the prop, once it gets to the child, it has to be renamed, or it has to be set to a different name, because the child accepts the prop as a different name. The reason for this is pretty much as kind of like a pattern that, or a coding pattern, or a coding best practice recommendation, is that you should name your props independent, or you should name your parameters independent of other functions that are calling it, because your function should live independently. It's the whole idea of composition and creating components that live in isolation. So the reason I say prop drilling has a bad stigma, by that I'm implying that it isn't necessarily a bad thing to do. But what I mean is, if you choose not to follow the rule of making sure that the props are named appropriately, and the grandchild is named is using the prop similarly to how it is named in the great grandparent. So if the grandchild is also accepting car label and not car tag ID, then the prop can be passed from the grandparent to the grandchild seamlessly, without having to worry about names, without having to worry about tracking where it is. So one strategy that I have used successfully in the past is creating a state variable. So the pattern I follow is every component, every React component that has child React components is going to pass its entire state as a prop to that child, starting all the way up from the root component down to the lowest level component. So if you have a property in the root component called car label, that prop will be also attached to the state of that root component and passed down to the grandparent, as the pattern suggests that all state gets passed down as a prop to the child components. So, and it will do the same thing for its child components and its child's components. It will keep passing down that state object, and it will attach to that state object whatever props it's created, and whatever state it's created is initialized with. It will be attached to that prop that's being passed down to its children. So the end result is it's going to be a little bit bloated. It's somewhat of, you're breaking the rules a little bit here, but the end result is that all your components kind of have access to all the props that the root component has, all the state that every component has all the state of the parent and grandparent components passed down to it as part of its props. So you don't have to needle or thread the needle anymore. It's almost as though you've just stacked all the needles in one direction and you're just threading them once. So instead of trying to rename it and threading and renaming, you're just putting all the needles, all the eyes of the needle are, aligned, and you're taking the thread and you're just passing it once. That, as opposed to using Redux for this, whereby you have your components and you still have to thread the needle. It's just that it's inverted. It's an inversion of control. So instead of threading the needle so much, you're just I'd say that you thread the needle kind of without having to go through every single eye of needles. So you go directly from, you introduce a new component. So you have now, with Redux, you have the external store, and all you're doing is now you have one needle, one thread. You have multiple threads. You have a thread for each needle. So if you think of the components as needles, you have a thread from the store to each needle. However, if you're using React's default state container, what you can think of is as the thread. There is no external store. You just have needles, and the thread is going through each eye of the needle. The eye of the needle is a component. So each of the needles, the thread is going through them.